Chapter 11 is language. So this week we will be talking about a few different things. We're going to start with the universality of language, and we'll talk about the different levels that we will look at that fall under language. So first, defining language. It is a system of communication using sounds or symbols. So you can think even things like cave drawings would count as language and a system of communication. Then moving on to oral history, anything that expresses feelings, thoughts, ideas, and experiences. So this encompasses a few different areas, and it is like a hierarchical system. So in chapter 10, we talked about categorization, and we looked at hierarchies and semantic networks. You can think about language in a very similar way. So language includes very small components that can be combined to form larger units. So we will talk about words that then can be combined into sentences, sentences that can then be combined into stories, and even further than that, ongoing dialogue and conversation. Another important feature of language is that it is governed by rules. And so in the same way that we were looking at categories in the hierarchy, the everything that is in the lower levels of the hierarchy, the upper sections must be true. So there are specific ways the components can be arranged to make sense to us. Now we all have learned over time how to interpret Yoda, and so Yoda says, "Much to learn you still have." And we're still able to get the meaning of Yoda's message because we know how to reorganize that message into a sentence that does make sense. You still have much to learn. The idea that language is universal is one that has been established by many, many studies in the psychology world. And these are just a few of the studies that have been presented. So first, we know that deaf children invent sign language that is all their own. This is similar to twins who kind of form a way of communicating with one another. All humans are born with a capacity to develop language and to be able to interpret the rules. So when you think about language acquisition and how a child learns how to speak, there are innate ways that they are picking up those rules. We also know that language is universal across cultures. There may be differences, but that phrase there, unique but the same, is very important. So we, over time, in different pockets of the world, have developed different ways of communicating, but everything, all languages contain nouns, verbs, negatives, questions. They all contain tenses, so we have past tense, present tense, future tense. So even though there are differences even in the way our mouths are shaped or formed, all of those rules are the same. And then the other point there that I skipped over is that the development and acquisition process is similar across cultures. So we won't talk much about acquisition today, but you can think of a baby and how they all go through a babbling phase, right? So we often use goo goo gaga as an example of what a baby might say, but that is truly universal across all infants. So we know that there is a universality to language. There are two prominent psychologists that started studying language in cognitive psychology. We've already heard about B.F. Skinner because of behaviorism, so it should be no surprise that the title of his work was Verbal Behavior. And so Skinner argued that we learn language through reinforcement. So the example would be that a child or an infant experiments with different language techniques and words, etc., and that through reinforcement of correct rule usage and correct word usage, that child would learn to speak. Noam Chomsky, in the same year, produced syntactic structures, and he argued that because language is universal, that there's an underlying basis of all language that's similar. And he argues that Skinner can't be right because children produce words, sounds, and sentences that they have never heard and that have never been reinforced. So that is the argument against behaviorism and reinforcement. So over time, over the late 50s, early 60s, we came to call this psycholinguistics. And so a lot of it has to do with acquisition, but there are really 4 elements of studying language in cognitive psychology. The first is comprehension, so how do we hear and process language? Speech production, how do we learn the rules and then apply them through our oral speech? And representation we will also cover. What we will not discuss too much today is acquisition. So we will focus on those top 3 in the next videos to come.